Hey everybody, I'm Amanda with Devexpress and welcome to today's webinar, Getting Started with Devextreme React Grid Part 1, presented by Devexpress Web Program Manager Mehul Harry. In this webinar, learn how to get started with the new Devextreme React Grid. You will learn about the Devextreme React Grid's composable plugin-based architecture, Bootstrap theming, and more. This session is being recorded and it will be made available on our Devexpress YouTube channel later today. We will also do a live Q&A at the end of this presentation. Just type your questions in the GoToWebinar control panel at any time throughout the broadcast. All right, thank you so much for joining us. I will now hand things over to Mehul.
Thank you, Amanda. Welcome everybody to the Devextreme Getting Started with the Devextreme React Grid. And in today's webinar, I'm going to be talking specifically about how to get started with the Devextreme React Grid. And in today's webinar, there's a lot of how to do things. For example, how to create a project and how to add Bootstrap and so forth. So I'm going to be covering a lot of code-based things, a lot of command line, NPM, all that good stuff to get started with our React Grid and its feature set and so forth. But there's a bigger question that you may all be interested in, and that is, what is React? And so to explain this new technology, and it's been around a couple of years, but to explain this, I have a very special guest. So, ladies and gentlemen, I want to welcome our very own Mr. Julian Bucknall.
Well, thank you very much, Mehul, and welcome everybody. Mehul asked me to do a quick intro to React. I mean, I get it. You know, Devexpress is known for its grid suites on multiple platforms. And since we have a grid for Devextreme and the web, in other words, it's pure JavaScript, why write another one? And how should I react to this React grid? What is React? Look, simply put, React is a UI framework for the web that was initially designed and developed by Facebook. Since UI frameworks are a dime a dozen these days, there must be something else that's special about React to make it stand out from the crowd, if you like. Sufficiently so that we, Devexpress, would write yet another grid. Now, for me, when I was learning about React, there were a couple of things which really stood out. Now, first of all, React is about components. React components can contain other components. And in fact, it's components all the way down. At the top is usually something called the application component or app or something like that. A component in the React sense is a JavaScript object that descends from an ancestral React component. So we're object-oriented. It is given some read-only properties. They're known as props in React land. And from them knows how to emit HTML to draw itself. This is the render method. And that contains some data, which is known as the state about itself. Now, obviously, it also knows how to tell its subcomponents to render themselves too. The main things about the data for a component are that props, the initial set of data, is read-only, and state is writable. But state is only writable through a special method called setState. Now, why is that? Because React is in charge when it comes to rendering. A component never tells itself to render. It's either changing the state through setState that does so, or it's some other component further up the chain of command. It never just redraws part of itself willy-nilly. It's told to by React through the render method. And why all this? Because React is designed to aggregate view changes. Now, rather than provide new views higgledy-piggledy, thereby overworking the browser, React stores its HTML in a virtual or a shadow DOM, DOM meaning the object, document object model. There is then some kind of diff type function that compares the real browser DOM with this virtual DOM and then transfers any changes to that real DOM. This goes to another important thing about the render method. It just returns the HTML that will render the component. It does not try and change the browser's DOM to display itself. If you like, React components know nothing about the browser. In fact, the HTML you write for an application usually consists of one named div element, sometimes called root, sometimes called app, or whatever it may be. When the application is started, you provide React with that name or ID, and then it will do the rest and inject the relevant DOM pieces into that named div element. So with regard to the basic operations with React, it's components who are given props so that they can initialize themselves, that maintain some state, and that can return the HTML that will render themselves when asked. In the background is this whole framework to efficiently render an app and all its components in the browser. The other big thing that React makes use of is a special language called JSX. This is essentially JavaScript, the JS part, that's been extended, the X part, with HTML markup. There's a special compiler build step that converts this special JavaScript code into the normal JavaScript that we would recognize, much as, say, ES6 code is converted to older JavaScript variants. I'll note you don't have to use JSX at all. You can just write standard JavaScript, but it certainly makes that render method way easier to write, to read, and to understand. And with that, it's back to you, Mehul.
Thank you very much, Julian. And as Julian mentioned, one of the key benefits of React is they solved an issue with websites that, especially client-side sites, that can make it slow. And that is that a lot of times JavaScript frameworks update the DOM way more than they have to. And so React comes along and says, listen, I know you've got a document object model in this page, and rather than constantly updating that, because the browser is not good at that, that becomes the bottleneck. And instead, React comes and says, look, I'm going to make a copy of this, just a JSON object of the same DOM object model, and it's going to be virtual. So React is now managing that for us. So now it gives us a better separation of concerns, where it tells the browser, you do what you do. You worry about painting and all that good stuff. Programmer, you worry about, the code and so forth, and I will manage DOM updates. As Julian said, it batches them for us and writes, and so we're going to get into sort of this idea of how even state works, and I'm going to tackle that in the next webinar. But React is really, really awesome. As I've been working with it, I've become a big fan of it, and today we're going to show you why we got into React ourselves. So basically, a lot of customers came to us and said, listen, we really like what you've done with, all the jQuery and the Angular and stuff. You guys really know these larger UI elements like a grid and so forth. And we want you to jump into React because we like what we see there. And we want Devexpress to provide something like a grid with great features. So when we first started developing it, we asked ourselves, well, there's a couple of ways we can go about this. We can take our existing DevExtreme grid that we have. So we have a lot of things for DevExtreme. However, these currently have jQuery in them and so forth. But, we said if we did that, they wouldn't be really truly native React controls. And we wanted to make those. And we asked you, the community, and you said the same thing. You said, look, whatever it takes, do it the right way. And we did that. It cost us more time, but we said we're going to do this the right way. And so what we've got is a truly native grid that we wrote from scratch. And by doing this, it allowed us to make some nice design decisions. First and foremost, we decided that we're going to make it composable and extensible. As you've learned, that React is very much component based. And if you're not familiar, ES6 has this concept of web components, and React truly takes advantage of that. And so we made ours in the same manner, and you'll see this as we go forward. So for example, the grid at its most basic sense, when you first add it, has very little in it, and you build up the feature set and items that you'll need. And that's a philosophy of React. Second, we were able to take all the best performance tricks, best practice to get a really, really performant grid. And we know this because we've compared it. And so generally we don't, show you numbers versus others, but we know where we stand, and we want you to just experience it for yourself. It's one of the fastest grids out there. As well as we've provided a certain approaches to theming. we decided, because we're writing this from scratch, we don't have a lot of time, we decided, hey, listen, let's just adopt for themes existing libraries that are out there. So we adopted the React Bootstrap library, which gives you access to Bootstrap 3 themes, as well as the Google Material UI library, which gives you access to the Google Material UI design language. And this allows you to also use the smaller controls that are available. So Bootstrap, as you know, provides things like a Navbar, button, and so forth. And we said, well, look, we're going to stick to the big items that we are really good at, which is like a grid and so forth. So speaking of that, it is currently in CTP mode. Now, how do you find it? You go to js.devexpress.com, click on integration, and eventually we're going to have, these are going to be linkable where we'll just click an item and get to it. But for now, you can just click on read documentation and click on this React. Or just go to Google and type in DevExtreme React and you'll land on our similar page here. So we've got a nice landing page where you can experience the demos and see the different themes. So here's Material UI with its little animations, as well as Bootstrap 3. Or if you click on theming, you can even see what different Bootstrap 3 themes look like. But these let you experience how fast it is as well. So for example, in this virtual scrolling mode, you can see I'm just flying through all this. All right, so today what I want to do is show you what's the starting point. You know, like if you were doing something in Visual Studio, you got this file new experience and it's fairly easy to get started. Well, when you first see, you know, this page from React, you're like, okay, get started. All right, so I understand they're explaining the how, but I want to know, you know, like what do I need to get started in code? So that's what we're going to do. And along the way, we'll talk about things like JSX and all that good stuff. Okay, so to get started, I'm going to be using a couple of tools today quite a bit. Obviously, command line comes in quite a bit because this is all out there in the open. And I should mention that our DevExtreme project it's known as DevExtreme Reactive, and it's one of the first ones. We basically started right on GitHub. We moved DevExtreme to GitHub recently, but this particular project started right on GitHub. And eventually, maybe we'll package it up into our installs and all that good stuff. But for now, you can find it here, as well as give us feedback. So you can go here, tell us what you think, feature you want, and so forth. And I'll talk more about that later, about feedback there. So I'll be using this quite a bit. And to get started with React, Facebook understood that there's a lot of what they call JavaScript fatigue out there. You know, because there's a lot of frameworks out there. There's Ember, there's Angular, there's Vue and React. And they said, you know, developers like that all this good stuff is happening with ES6 and a lot of interesting things are happening on the client side stuff. But people are also getting a little bit tired. They said, well, okay, how do we help them along? So to help you, what they've done is there is a project out there that's called the Create React app. Now, this project essentially is a getting started for React. And it's really easy to install. You do the typical npm install, you know, -g for global, and this will install it for you. But once it's installed, all you got to do is call it, give it a project name. It will create a folder, and then you just go in the folder and start it. And when you do, it'll launch the browser. So let's do that while we get started. So I'm going to call this Create React App DRG1 for DevExtreme React Grid. And what it's going to do, it's going to go out to the web and grab the packages that we need, including the React package, React DOM, and React scripts. And you're going to see this concept a lot, by the way. React, and you'll see something like -DOM. The -DOM typically refers to the web side of things. There is a mobile story for React, and it's called React-Native. We're not going to be dealing with that at all in part 1 or 2. I'm dealing only with the DOM stuff. So while it's getting that, let's take a look at what we're going to be getting. It's going to create a nice folder structure for us with a README, a git ignore, all that good stuff, and we got an index.html. But as you imagine, we'll be working mostly in the source folder. Now, and I should also mention, I'll be dealing mostly with NPM. However, Facebook has a version of NPM called Yarn. You can use that. Yarn commands work as well. If you've got Yarn installed, those commands will work as well. But I'm going to stick with NPM mostly today. So let's also talk a little bit about why use this. So they have a really good approach that says, listen, by using this Create React app, you're going to get support for React, JSX, ES6, and Flow, as well as just a ton of things nice getting started practices. However, the feature set is limited by design. They haven't put in things like server rendering or CSS module, and that's because they said, look, once you become an expert, then go ahead and use something else. And they mentioned some alternatives down below. But it's just a really nice approach, and a lot of people I know are using this. Okay, now, as I mentioned here, just to get started, you can just go into the folder. So we'll go into our folder. And before npm started, let's bring it up in Visual Studio Code. And I'll just type in code dot, which will bring up my Visual Studio Code. And now we'll see that we've got, obviously, all our node modules. And I don't recommend clicking on that. There's a ton of modules in there. But here we've got our general index.html file, and that's all fine. But mostly, source is where everything happens. So package.json, because it's using Webpack, will tell us that, oh, okay, we've got our React packages. Great. And in it, we have a starting point. And as Julian mentioned, that React works with the DOM. And by the way, I've got some Visual Studio Code has some really nice extensions that you can use. I've got like a nice font and theme and all that. And if you're curious about all that, I'll have my Twitter later that you can ask me about. But in general, I've added things like ESLint, or you can add a ton of things. It also provides you capability to debug. So there's a Chrome extension that it hooks into that you can set breakpoints. I mean, JavaScript development has come a long way in a really good way. So the starting point for us is generally index, and you can see here we've got a method we've got a call out to the React DOM, and the render method says, listen, hook into the root element, and I want you to render the app component. So where is app? Well, this, as you'll see, and you'll see this quite a bit here, you're going to see something called import at the very top. And this is a ES6 concept of components and so forth. So we've got our packages and components we're using from those packages. And so, as is the case, our components are listed as app.js. We've got a test file, we've got a CSS file. But mostly our true starting point is here in app. And here, we've got something that says app extends component, and we've got our render method, and it returns something that looks like HTML code. And this is really one of the strengths of React, this ability to do JSX. And I say it looks like HTML, and it is mostly HTML, but there's some key differences. For example, class name typically would be div class, but since class is a reserved word in JavaScript, it's renamed to class name. So mostly it'll be HTML. However, as we'll see is we're able to use other components in here going forward. So we're going to be doing that. And another really nice feature is that this is a JavaScript file. This is not an HTML file where we are inserting JavaScript. This is a JavaScript file where we're inserting HTML. And what's nice about that is that we have things like IntelliSense and the ability to debug and all that good stuff. And as you'll see, another nice feature about JSX is, for example, let's take a look at that example earlier. And here, what's nice is once we start this project, in fact, let's do that. Let's do npm start, and this will launch our little node server. But what's nice is that it's hooked in to Chrome, and so it's going to refresh for us. And anytime we make a change in our code, it's going to update and recompile. So what's really nice though is that it'll also tell us of any errors. So here, for example, if I accidentally remove an ending div here, it's letting us know, oh, hey, listen, you've got a problem here. This code is not looking the way it should. And once we fix it, it'll update as well. And that hot reloading feature will automatically keep it updated so we'll see our changes right away. All right, so let's put this window a little bit here on this side, and I'm just going to play window juggling here. All right, so what do we get with Create React App? With one command, we've got a nice little setup here, and in it, as you can see, we've got a simple logo, and here's a little spinning logo, and something that says Welcome to React. And if I type in DevExtreme, you'll see that compiler will kick off and it'll update our page. So we've got hot reloading as well, and just a little getting started. Okay, so that is very fine and dandy. As you can see, it's not difficult to get started with React at all. So what we want is to now bring in Bootstrap. Now, I say bring in Bootstrap because this allows you to now use not just anything from Bootstrap. And I won't go into Bootstrap, and I think my colleague Don is going to have a webinar on Bootstrap soon. So, but if you're not familiar, it's a front, as they say, the most popular front-end framework. And not only because it provides you a bunch of themes, but it provides you a way to create responsive websites. And so what they've done is there is a project out there that takes Bootstrap and wraps it for React. And I say wraps it because Bootstrap provides a bunch of things like navbars and so forth. And we can't just directly use those components. We can't directly use those. Instead, what we want to do is use them as components. And as you heard, everything in React is a component. And this idea works very well. So let me step back for 1 minute here and explain that one of the key things you have to remember about React is it is not like other frameworks. In fact, React is a library that is concerned with the view portion only. So if you were thinking MVC, there is no model, there's no controller. It's concerned mainly with the view. And we see that here. We are basically hooking into the root element and saying, here, this is what you're going to spit out. So later on, we're going to learn how to do something like routing and so forth. But for now, this is one of the beautiful things about React, that it is so lightweight, it is so simple, and a lot of people do like it for this reason. Okay, so in order to use Bootstrap, we are going to make a bunch of the React items available as components, and so we can use and set certain things with them. So what they've done is there's this popular React Bootstrap library that has done this. So what we want to do is we want to use this library, and we're going to basically need to do that. Now, in the Create React app, there is a section that talks about how to import it in. And let's do that. So we're going to be bringing in the packages from this library. So let me show you. And by the way, I will have links to all of this stuff, I promise. But you'll see this, there's a lot that we're going to be working in from the command line. So we're going to bring in this React Bootstrap library, but we're going to bring it in version 3. There's different versions. The 3 is their current released version. I believe they're working on 4. But this is the version we're going to use because the Bootstrap 3 is what we support from the DevExtreme Grid. Now, one of the reasons I like Visual Studio Code is because they've got this built-in terminal that I can run commands for, since I'm already using this window for my node server. All right, so let's kick that off. Now, while it goes and installs this, let's talk a little bit about what we're going to be doing. So what's nice is that we can then use components from this package. So for example, if we wanted to use the navbar, the jumbotron, and the button from Bootstrap, this React Bootstrap has done a nice job of componentizing them, allows us to use them. And also we're going to need to use its theme. So we're going to import these statements in. So now that it's finished, we'll see some warnings, but generally it's successful. So now this Bootstrap is going to allow us to use the themes, and we're going to use these CSS files. And it recommends that we put these before any custom CSS files. So we'll do that. So let's do that right before our current app CSS, which may have some custom themes. Now, you saw in the background this was updating. So what happened is, we can't tell, but it did change the font a little bit. But did it really change, and do we really have Bootstrap available as a package now? Well, let's see. So they have an example here. So let me just show you quickly how this example works. So here we've got an import statement, and I'll explain what components using. But it also uses, for example, a navbar and a jumbo button and a couple other things. So let's just show you real quick what this looks like. So let's go back here and keep an eye on our project here. But what's going to happen is I'm going to change this around and just put in their example. And what their example says is, listen, I want you to import this thing called grid, navbar, jumbotron, and button from the Bootstrap library. Now you might be going, oh, grid? Bootstrap has a grid? Not exactly. They're in web parlance, as they say, there is two different definitions for grid. In CSS terms, grid refers to the layout of the page, how there's a header section, footer section, and then you can have a grid of, let's say, 12 rows and so forth. And so that's what Bootstrap is talking about. And if you're using hours and you don't want to get too confused, you can always say grid as Bootstrap grid or something like that. You can change that and give it a alias, and then you can change that tag here. But that's what they're referring to. Our grid is going to be talking about when you have a set of information that you want to display in a table-based view with rows and columns and features and all that good stuff. All right, and then they've also got this Navbar where there's the sort of home link for ours is called React App, and there's a button. Okay, that's all fine and dandy. And you can see now if we were able to include a theme from any Bootstrap theme, it would instantly change and all that good stuff. But I don't want to use this. Instead, we're going to just roll that back. Instead, what I want to do is show you, once you've got support for Bootstrap, now we can start using Devextreme Grid. Now, the reason I say you want to use it is because, as I mentioned, by design, we at Devextreme said we don't have any theming engine in there. So you have to essentially decide, do I want to go start with Bootstrap or Material UI? Now, in this webinar, I'm going to stick with Bootstrap, but if you join me for part 2, I'll talk about other things like remote data binding, statefulness, and I'll use the Material UI version. Now, to bring Devextreme in, obviously decide on Bootstrap or Material UI, but you want to import in the Devexpress packages for React. Now, as I mentioned, we've designed our packages in a way that it works very well for React. So not only, in the past, you may have seen like, oh, well, I just download this one NPM package and I have everything that I need. In this case, what we've done is we've separated in a way and put them in the packages where they belong. So for example, our core package has the things that belong to the Devexpress React core stuff. And so for example, at the moment, we only have one control, and that's the grid, and that's in CTP, and we're working on releasing it soon. But in the future, we hope to have more. And, and obviously it'll be based on your feedback on what we should make and features it should have and all that good stuff. And then we have a package that's called the Grid DX React Grid, and this contains items that are specific to the grid, for example, paging and sorting and so forth. And then there's visual specific grid package. So for example, the DX React Grid Bootstrap is going to be different from the Grid Material UI, of course, because they provide a different look and feel to it. So what we want to do is bring those in. So let's bring those in. And as we kick this off, what you'll find is that it's going to go and download any packages. So for example, before, when we downloaded our React Bootstrap package, it grabbed React Bootstrap for us, but it also, because it's based on Bootstrap, grabbed the Bootstrap package. So in the same way, this is going to take care of any dependencies for us as well. And this is one of the things I really like about it. And by the way, if you're looking at any of this code and you're like, hey, as I mentioned, ping me on Twitter later and I'll tell you all the good stuff that I'm using here. All right, so now we've got this installed. We want to make sure that we bring in, the right version, Bootstrap or Material UI. And I said, I'm going to go with the Bootstrap. So let's bring this in as well. All right, so this allows us to now, once this is installed, we can use this. Now, as you'll see that when you use components, they generally are loaded in some package. For example, we've got this React package, and in it, we're going to have some things that we're using from that package. So we'll see this concept a lot. So what we want to do is when we use the Devextreme React Grid, now that it's installed successfully, we're going to call an import statement. And so this is a concept of obviously ES6, but this allows us to say, listen, I'm going to import a couple of components. I want to use a couple of components from this package called the DX React Grid Bootstrap 3. And this is going to allow us to start using the grid. So we've got grid and table view. And you might go, table view? Well, I'll explain in just a second. But to use it, let me bring in the code and then we'll explain it away. So let's go back to our layout here, our review. Now, if I just add this grid, and I'm gonna remove some of this stuff. Instead, we'll just have our basic div, and in it, we're gonna put this grid. But it's like, well, wait a minute, you've got a problem here, and we'll address this problem. This is the nice thing about JSX. And I should also mention, you'll see this a lot in developing with a lot of client-side libraries. You'll be working along, whoops, I forgot a semicolon, I forgot a comma, I forgot to define something. Just take a deep breath, read the message, and you'll be fine. So, and I'll address this here in a second, but basically, we've got our grid component. And again, if you want to alias this as, DS, React Grid, or whatever, you can do that. But for now, I'm just going to call it grid. And in it, we've got a property called rows that wants to bind to something called customers. Now, I don't have anything defined customers in here. So we're going to do that in just a second. So let's do that. Now, I'm going to bring in a file. It's a very simple file. And basically, it is just a JSON-based file called customers.js. And as you can see, it's JSON-based. I've got some columns in there like customer ID, company name, and so forth. So what I want to do is tell this view that, hey, I want to use that. So I'm going to say import customers. And as you can see, we've got some nice completion there and all that. From customers, /customers. Now you might say, well, how come you don't type .js? Well, again, that's because we've got Webpack installed and all that. And as you saw, it's compiling in the background. And now that we got a little logo, it's giving us a warning. Hey, listen, you've got logo, but you're not really using it anywhere. So, we can just comment that out too if we wanted to remove the warning. But, this is the nice feature about JSX. And as you can see, we've just added our grid. We've got the columns binding to customers, and we've got the rows binding to customers, and we've defined our columns. And we've got the name of the column from the JSON file, and of course the titles of it. And then of course, table view tells us it's the component that displays it. So we've got here the most bare minimum of a grid that you can possibly get. And you might say, whoa, Mehul, what's going on? Well, as you are typically used to from us, that when you use a grid, you got all these nice things like paging and sorting, and we'll put a lot of those basic things as enabled by default. But in React's case, we did not, and that's by design. Again, there's not even a table header row here, and the reason is React's approach and philosophy is that you are in control. You have complete control over what gets displayed. As you can see, we are dealing with, directly, not directly, we can affect DOM elements and so forth. But what's nice is React wants you to work with this component approach that says, hey, listen, one, everything is a component. Two, keep your components light so that everything remains fast. In fact, we can even take this grid and put it in its own components, which we'll do a little bit later. But this idea that if you want things like, if you want more functionality like paging and sorting, you want to add those in there, and you'll see that as well. So for example, if you take a look at our docs, we've got this great plugin overview that talks about, look, for state management, we have plugins. For data processing, we have plugins. We have plugins for everything. And this is the composable, extensible plugin architecture that I was speaking about. So if you wanted something, let's say like paging, you're going to need to bring in certain plugins. And that's by design. So if you wanted just some local paging like this, let's do that. Let's bring that in. And we'll see here how this works. So, let's first, for example, let's take a look here. And we don't even have our column names displayed. How do we do that? Well, that's a plugin called Table Header Row. And Table Header Row is going to allow us to display those. So Table Header Row, as we'll see here, now will display the column names. But if I click on any of those columns, there's no sorting. We're going to need to add that. So everything is a plugin. And you'll see this from our item as well. Okay, so before we add features, let's talk a little bit about sort of navigation and routing. As I mentioned, this is concerned only with the view of what we're displaying, and so React necessarily isn't really easy to go like, typically in MVC you might say, oh, well, I have a folder that's called home, and I have a folder called about, and there's all this separation, and I just create that, and automatically if I go /about, it'll go to that page. Well, how do we do that? How do we do add navigation and routing? Well, navigation obviously is the ability to navigate to different pages, and routing is the ability to take that link and route it to where it needs to go. And so let's set up something for navigation first. What I want to do is, since we've got Bootstrap itself has a very nice nav bar, and it's responsive. So I want to use that. Let's bring in this responsive nav bar from React that allows to create links, drop downs, and anything, and place to the left or the right, and the home and all that. And again, it's responsive so that when we collapse something, it'll turn into a hamburger menu. So if I wanted to use this, how do we do that? Well, as we saw earlier, because we've got the React Bootstrap package installed here, we can just start using it. So let's do that. I'm going to import in. I'm going to call it import statement here, and here I'm telling it that we want to use the navbar, the nav, and the nav item from React. So let's bring in a little bit of code, and again, we can find examples of all of this stuff on that React Bootstrap page that I had said. But now let's put it right before our grid. So what we've got here now is a navbar component, and in it we're setting Devextreme React as the home link, and I've got a couple of links defined. I've got home and grid, and they're just nav items. But if I click on them, they don't actually go anywhere. That's because we haven't defined routing yet. And so this now gives us a UI element for navigation. But what we want to do is we want to set up React to take us to those actual links. So how do we do that? Well, let's bring in another package, and this is actually provided by another company altogether. It's not provided by Facebook, but it's provided by a couple of really smart guys, and it's called React Router. And React Router works with the Create React app, and you can install it, with the React Router DOM. And yes, there's a React Router native as well. But the web version is what we're interested in. But what it does, it allows you to use certain components, like browser router, route, and link. And these help you to create routing within React. So let's do that. Let's start bringing these packages in since we're going to need them. And I'm going to install a couple of things. First is React Router DOM. Install the React Router DOM, the web-based version. So in this version, the React Router DOM, we're going to use the browser router and a couple other things. Now, before we can actually use them, we're going to need one other library. And it's kind of odd. So now that we've got it installed, so let me kick this library off as well. And it's called the React Router Bootstrap. And you might say, wait a minute, I've got React Bootstrap and I got React Router. What is React Router Bootstrap? Well, React Router Bootstrap essentially is a bridge. A bridge is the React Bootstrap library, which provides those components for Bootstrap, and React Router, which provides routing, but it's the integration between those two packages. And so what that means is, let's say we've got a button from Bootstrap. Well, if you want that button to make it behave like a link in React Router, then you need this link container that this package provides. And so then we can wrap something in link container and have it route somewhere. That's all it does. So you might say, Mehul, my head is spinning, all these packages. Yes, it seems a little odd, but I promise you, it's actually there to make your life easier. Okay, so now that we have these installed, let's use them. So the first thing is, let's bring in a couple of items from the router DOM, and that is, we're going to be using browser router, route, and link. And It's called as router. The browser router is called as router because they're like on version 4 now, and previously it was always known as router. So, for making life easier for people, I believe they're calling it just as that. And then from the React Router Bootstrap, the integration package, we're going to be using link container. So how do we use them? Well, we're basically going to take a couple of items, our nav items, and wrap them in link container, just like we see here. Now, if I take these two nav items, as you can see here, I'm just going to wrap them, and that's all we've done. We've said, look, I've still got my home and I've still got my grid that are nav items from Bootstrap, but now to route them, I want you to wrap them in this link container. And 2 tells it where we're going to go. 2 is going to go to the slash root, and this exact statement simply says, hey, if there's ever another item that goes to slash, well then this is the one true link that should go to the home page. And then we're also going to need something called grid. Now at this point, I've simply said where they should go. I haven't actually created those items. So let's do that. So what we're going to do is we're going to use a couple of items called we're going to use a couple of components called route. So here I've got now where these link containers should point to. So the route says, hey, if anybody goes to go to slash, go look for a component called home view. Well, I don't have a home view. And the same thing, if they want to go to slash grid, go and render the grid view component, but we don't have that either. So let's do that. So what I want to do instead is I want to take our grid component and make another component out of it altogether. So to do that, we're going to use some little really nice ES6 here, and it basically says, listen, I'm going to create a const grid view, and it's returning an anonymous function that essentially just renders this little bit of code. And what is it? This code right here. And this syntax right here basically says this is also a stateless component. And I'll talk about state later, and I'll address a little bit. But in essence, we have now created a stateless component. So now we've separated it out. Now, in the same way, I need one for the home view, because now I have a way to get to the grid view, but I don't have one for the home view. And it's telling us just that right now. It's trying to go to the root. So for example, if we go to grid, it'll probably render our grid just fine, but no, it still wants our home view it wants us to define our home view first. So let's do that. So here now, when I type in this const home view, just return a h1 that says hello world, it will work out just fine. So now it's trying to route to it. Now, there's a couple of other things that are key to this. So let's talk about that. We've defined our link containers, we've defined our routes. Why isn't it routing? Well, there's one key piece that you have to remember, and that is you have to route the whole thing in the router component. And this will allow it to handle the routes. Okay, now that we've done that, when we go to slash grid, it's going to want to display our grid. And when we click on home, it's going to say, oh yeah, there's your H1 hello world. That's it. Simple as that. Now that we've got navigation, now we've got grid, you know what? I don't want a grid that I have to scroll all the way down for. How do I handle paging? Well, as I said before, these are components that we're going to need to bring in. So let's do that. Let's start adding components from it. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we actually imported more than just one package. We didn't just import this grid pack, this Bootstrap package. We also imported the DX React Grid. And why is paging state and local paging in there and not in this package, in the Bootstrap package? Well, it's because these are features dealing with most common grid functions. And of course, you know, the UI based stuff is going to be in here. And so for paging, we're going to need paging state. We've got local paging, and we're also going to need something called paging panel. However, since that is UI specific, it's going to go in the Bootstrap version. So as you can imagine, for mature UI, there'd be a different paging panel. All right, so now we've said we want to import those in. How do we start using them? Well, this is where we can come into our grid and say, hey, listen, I want you to add default paging of size 10 and its local paging But we also want to make sure that we display that by using the paging panel. So let's go back here. And as we'll see, we sort of have some paging, but we don't have the paging panel displayed yet. So it's having some troubles. So make sure we add the paging panel as well. So now I've got this paging panel that says, okay, you've got local paging and it's of size 10. So I can easily page through it. And as you can see, it still remains light and fast. Now, we're adding components, we're adding features, we're building up functionality. This is, as you can see, the Pyro of React. And again, if you wanted to separate out this grid into a whole separate file, it's absolutely possible. You're going to need some things like import statements and extend the component, and you have to export, sort of export default grid view and all that good stuff. So there's a couple extra things. So I do recommend for larger projects that you do that. For this example, it just makes sense to keep it all here so we can quickly go through this. Now, let's talk about plugin order. The order in which you add plugins matters, and we'll see that. So let's say, for example, we want sorting. Well, as you can imagine, for paging, we had a couple of packages. Same thing for sorting. We're going to need sorting state and local sorting. So let's bring those in. So again, it matters how you bring them in. So I'm going to bring paging in before sorting. So I've got local sorting state and I've got local sorting, and you can see there's other packages for filtering and grouping and all that. And I don't have any specific view items for sorting, and that's because sorting generally is added as a feature to the table header row, and we already have a table header row. So to use sorting state, essentially we can just add that feature in there. So we're going to add it right after we do paging. So we got sorting state, and of course we've got local sorting. And as soon as I do that, I have the capability, but I haven't actually added it. So I want to tell table header row to allow sorting. And don't worry, all this is in examples, and I will publish this if any of you are interested. But now, just by doing that, when I click on this item, you can see we have that capability. Okay, now here's where plugin order matters. If I go to this third page, hey, it's still sorted by company. What's going on? Some people might say, hey, listen, I don't want a global sorting. I just want per page sorting. Well, in that case, this is where plugin order matters, and you can swap around and have sorting come before paging, so then it will be per page. Again, or you can add a button that's, check boxes all the items and decides what is selected and what is not. All of this is sort of in your hands, as we say. Now, let me finish simply by saying that in the next webinar, I'm going to be talking about more items like how to do remote data binding. What is this thing with controlled and uncontrolled modes? For example, right now, the grid is in what I put as a controlled mode. It is stateless. That means the grid will manage the state. So for example, if you want to take control, how do you do that? How do you turn it into an uncontrolled stateful mode? And we'll talk about that in the next webinar. We'll also talk about custom templates, remote data binding, and using the grid with Redux. So we'll talk all about that, and we'll talk roadmap specific questions. So if you have questions like, hey, we'd like to see this or that, please let us know. And regarding that, I highly recommend that you go to our GitHub page, and you can find that right from this DevExtreme Reactive page. Click watch, click star, and then please give us feedback here. Our roadmap is very much defined by the feedback we get from you. We're all about customer stories. How are you using something? Give us your business scenario. We don't want to just know like, oh, we want this feature. Tell us how that you intend to use that feature so we can make it useful and interesting for everybody. We have a ton of experience building user interface controls for customers in all sorts of industries. So we want to hear from you. All right. With that, I will say, if you have any questions, please reach out to me either at my email or Twitter and let us know what it is that you want answered. With that, I want to say thank you again to my colleague Julian. Thank you, Amanda. And do we have any questions?
Hey, Mehul. We did have a couple questions come in that the team answered on the back end,
Mm-hmm.
mostly asking about upcoming potential features. Uh, would we be creating a default Devextreme light and dark skin for React? Let's see. When is infinite scrolling coming in Material UI?
All good questions. I would say for features like that, let us know, because we want to hear specifically how are you going to use that infinite scrolling. I absolutely believe that you're going to need it, but I just want to know, hey, we're going to bind to so and so data, and this is kind of data we're displaying. That kind of information really helps us to develop these features properly so that they work with everybody. All right, I see something that says React is great at dealing with rapidly updating data changes now. Have you ever looked at real-time changing and pulling data via Ajax? Jeppe, we've looked at all sorts of things, but again, I would ask, is that something that's useful for you? And if so, how? Oh, here's a really good question. Let me address this. Can I replace my ASPX grid view with this reactive grid? Yes, but you're going from a server-side technology to a client-side technology. And when you do that, one of the key differences is how you're going to be binding with data. On server-side technology, it's going back to the server, and therefore you have some advantages where .NET can have a data source and so forth. And with React, as you saw, you can either have data locally, and I've got a customer.js, or you can have a web service. And again, in the next webinar, I'll talk about how to do remote data binding. So if you're interested in that, please come by. But yeah, absolutely, it's possible. Just know there's a bit of a mind shift in terms of thinking about how data works in server-side and client-side. Now, when are we going to release this? Soon. When I say soon, we're working on it. It's very, very feature rich, but we're not done with it. And there's more things we want, but it's definitely coming. It's coming this year, most likely. But stay tuned. And again, we want to hear from you to make sure that we've got the feature set that are important to you. So let us know that we didn't miss anything. And there was a question about there was something about porting. Maybe I missed that.
Yes, the first one. Does it make sense to port things like Devextreme charts libraries to React?
We've talked a lot about, again, when I said earlier that we are, we have ideas sort of that we're kicking around, how best to do that. So I would simply say stay tuned. But yeah, for sure, we don't want to just deliver you one control. Obviously, we're a controls vendor, and that's what we do, make awesome libraries. So we have ideas about how we want to do this and what makes the best sense. But also, there's a ton of things that the Devextreme does, right? They work, obviously, there's guys working on MVC controls now. We've got the new MVC controls. There's guys working on Angular. There's guys working on React. There's a lot of things that the team works on. So as you can imagine, like any company, we have a limited set of resources. And so we can't just rewrite all the charts, but we are thinking how best to do this. And we want to do it, of course, the right way. And there are certain things happening that you'll hear more about in the future. For now, it's best to just go, this is the chart that I need. This is the chart I absolutely need now. This chart I wish I kind of had. It looks interesting, et cetera, et cetera. So let us know. Scenarios really help us define how best to deliver these products to you.
Great. Let's see. A couple more popped in. Are you working on the nonlinear tree grid? Is it part of the roadmap? The team answered yes.
Yeah, as far as the nonlinear tree grid, that is something, yes, we've looked at it, and I think it's something that'll likely be there. But for now, Shrisisti, I'm sorry, I didn't see your name right. But yes, it's something we're looking into, and let us know. Because the reason I keep pointing back to GitHub is this answer right now is going to be in a webinar, but when it's on GitHub, we can track it. We can give you specifics. There's other people who can vote on it, all that kind of good stuff. And again, it's the best place to talk about feature-specific items. And again, in the next version, I'll have more answers about sort of the overall roadmap. So please join us for that. And, again, we're going to be talking about some more advanced topics as well. And I do hope you join us for that as well. So thank you very much, Amanda. I'll hand it back to you.
Great. All right, everybody. We have several webinars coming up. You can register for them on our at devexpress.com/webinars. Next Tuesday, August 22nd, charting the return of the native. Devexpress just announced the beta of their charting library for native iOS and Android apps. In this session, technical evangelist Paul Usher will show how to get the most out of this new Devexpress chart suite on iOS, perhaps even swiftly, and debate with CTO Julian Bucknell the issues surrounding good UI on mobile real estate. August 29th, getting started with DevExtreme React Grid Part 2, so the second part to this webinar. You'll learn about the DevExtreme React Grid's composable plugin-based architecture, Bootstrap, material UI theming, stateless and stateful mode, remote data binding, and Redux support. Plus, we're going to talk more about that roadmap. And then September 12th, bootstrapping your web app with Devexpress. In this webinar, technical evangelist Don Wibier will build a small responsive web application by getting a third-party Bootstrap design and incorporating it together with the brand new Devexpress Bootstrap controls. And then finally, October 3rd, an in-depth look at ASP.NET version 17.1. Don Wibier is going to explore some of the new 17.1 features in detail and show you how to apply them in your own web applications. This webinar includes web forms as well as MVC samples. So that is all coming up. And again, you can register for them at devexpress.com/webinars. And like I mentioned before, today's webinar will be made available on our Devexpress YouTube channel. I posted that link in the chat box. And that is it for this one. Thank you so much to Mehul. Thank you all for joining us. And of course, thank you for choosing Devexpress. Bye-bye.